My name is Mary Bissell. I'm a librarian in the Toronto Reference Library in the Humanities and Social Sciences Department, and we have the pleasure of hosting this event tonight. So tonight I am pleased and have the pleasure to welcome to the Toronto Reference Library lawyer, writer, and activist Linda Silver Dranoff. Over the course of her 38-year legal career, Linda has been a tireless advocate for women's legal rights. She's been involved in a lobby by women lawyers for such issues as family law reform, charter equality rights, improved pay equity legislation, the decriminalization of abortion, and improved rape and sexual harassment laws. Linda is also the author of such books as Women in Canadian Law, Every Woman's Guide to the Law, and Every Canadian's Guide to the Law. And for 25 years, she wrote the legal advice column in Chatelaine magazine, which I certainly remember, and I'm sure a number of you do. Her most recent book, Fairly Equal, Lawyering the Feminist Revolution, is both a personal memoir of her life as a practicing lawyer and a social history that details the various legal milestones in the ongoing struggle for women's legal rights. Linda was the founding chair of the Feminist Legal Analysis section of the Ontario Bar Association. She's been honored by the Law Society of Upper Canada, the Toronto YWCA, the Canadian and Ontario Bar Associations, and the Women's Law Association, among others. In 2001, she received a Governor General's Award in commemoration of the Persons Case, which is an award that recognizes Canadians who advance gender equality. And in 2012, she was appointed to the Order of Canada. Tonight's talk, Violence Against Women as a Tool of Control, is really the first in a three-part series on the timely theme of equality of power. And following Linda's talk, there will be time for what I'm sure will be a lively and thought-provoking question and answer. And we also want to make sure that we leave time for anybody who might want to look at Linda's new book and perhaps get it signed by her. So please join me in welcoming Linda Silver Dranoff.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, everyone, for coming out to hear a subject which I think is of great interest to everybody these days, certainly to women. I think we've been working for equality for a I don't know how many varies to say, for a very long time. Let me introduce myself to those of you who don't know me, and I see a lot of friends here tonight, so you don't have to listen to the first paragraph. I'm a lawyer, and I believe in the rule of law. It has an essential role in a democracy to ensure fairness for everyone. I'm a woman, and I believe in equality for women, and indeed for everyone. It should not surprise you then if I say that I believe it is the role of law to make equality possible and to educate the public about society's expectations. I've also been a writer about law of all kinds throughout my career, and I've been an activist for law reform too. I happen to believe it's the responsibility of every citizen to speak out, to contribute to the public discourse, to stand on guard for our rights as citizens. Some of the ideas I'm going to talk about today I've described in my memoir and history of the women's movement, which perchance is for sale over here. Others are in Every Canadian's Guide to the Law, which has an exceptionally large section on abuse and victimization issues. Many of the ideas I've developed for this lecture speak to further possibilities, and I hope add to the public dialogue. The theme of this series of lectures is power as the source of equality for women. My premise is that women have in fact been treated unfairly, and that there's no justification for this. It's wrong now, it was always wrong. Unless women find a way to get men to share power with us and to use their power more wisely and with restraint, we will continue to be treated unfairly and unequally. You can't expect many men, particularly those holding the reins of power, to give it up easily or voluntarily. The history of women's activism for change has shown that arguing for fair treatment will not necessarily persuade men in power to share that power. And even if forced to share the power, they may find ways to erode it when we're not looking. Many women thought that men would be persuaded by the fairness argument. That argument seems to be more effective in persuading women, in fact, to act against their own self-interests and be enablers for men. But it hasn't worked as much to persuade men. And unfortunately, I think that means that women have to take a tougher stance. My conclusion is that women's actual power is the only solution to inject fairness and reflected in the law, enforcement of the law, and hopefully men will be encouraged by their own self-interest to go along, and women will be encouraged by their faith in themselves to continue the battle. We have to consider quotas where appropriate. Ours should not be a plea for largesse, but an insistence that equality must rule, or there'll be strong legal consequences. Women have power when we are supported with vigor by the power of the law and not left to our own individual devices, thinking that what happens to each of us is our own individual problem when it's usually a systemic problem. Women have power when we support each other and when we work together to effect change. Common to all three lectures that I'll be giving and to an understanding of the problems women face is the history of how this disparity in power developed and why it's become so ingrained in our culture. It's about the role of both men and women in creating the injustices in this world and permitting those injustices to last. I will discuss how we got here, the current realities, the laws applicable to them, and then I'll share some solutions that might prove useful and hopefully provoke conversation. So first the past, then the present, then the future. Because this is 3 lectures, it gives me the ability to have time to talk about how we got where we are today. The reason for women's dependent status in the law and society are extraordinarily complex. The roots are social and physiological, political and economic, historical and religious, and the story spans human history. We must understand these roots in order to understand why women are still struggling to achieve equality and to achieve the power that will sustain and reinforce that equality, and why men continue to resist. It all starts with the fact that there are actual differences between men and women, and those differences have been used as excuses for unfair treatment. Starting with basic physiology, men as a group are born with greater raw physical strength. In early days, it was male muscle that protected the community and the women. The other significant difference between men and women is, as we know, women are the ones who have the children and end up with the responsibility to raise them. And women had no control over childbirth historically, except for abstinence, which wasn't entirely up to them. Women were required to bear children. Women's childbearing function was controlled by laws prohibiting contraception and abortion. So women have always been regarded as dependent and subordinate to men. We had limited control over our own bodies and lives, over our children, and even less over anyone else. The man was considered the head of the household with full control. Women could not own property or inherit it. She did not even own her own clothing. The wife's paraphernalia, as it was called, belonged to the husband. And it was the father or husband who determined a woman's citizenship. All this led some men and women themselves to the conclusion that we were therefore inferior to men. This is how far it went. The Bible and religious thinking assumed that on marriage, husband and wife became one flesh. This one flesh concept was reflected in social realities and institutionalized in law, in the common law of England, the civil law, and the Napoleonic Code of France, and then Canadian law. So when a woman married, she and her man became one person. However, who was that one person? It was the husband. This meant that a husband in law, could not give anything to his wife because he couldn't give anything to himself. He couldn't enter into an agreement with her because he couldn't, I mean, he would be agreeing with himself. How could that be? Because she wasn't a legally separate person, she couldn't enter into a contract with anyone or be sued in court without his involvement. Now, her fortification against the world, in mythology at least, was supposed to be the husband's obligation to protect and support his wife. It didn't always work out that way. I became a family lawyer in 1974, before the law reforms, and I can tell you that women stayed in abusive marriages because they had little choice. If she left, she might be destitute and lose her children too. Sir William Blackstone, who wrote an influential summary of women's legal status in the common law in 1765, stated that he had the right to discipline her. As Blackstone said, the husband might give his wife moderate correction, just as he is allowed to correct his apprentices or children. This is a source in law of violence against women as a tool of control. Blackstone went on to summarize women's legal disabilities by saying that they were intended for their protection and benefit. Quote, "So great a favorite is the female sex of the laws of England," end quote. That was the mythology which many women accepted, but it wasn't factual. The Napoleonic Code had a similar view. Napoleon, in his memoir, said that women should not be considered equal with men, quote, "for they are in reality only machines for bearing children," unquote. "Woman is our property," he said, "just as the fruit tree is the property of the gardener." Woman's role was clearly defined. To women belong beauty, grace, and the art of seduction. Her obligations are dependency and subjection. There was no doubt in his mind that one sex must be subject to the other. He anticipated, Napoleon did, a complete revolution in society if women became independent. I'm happy to say, aren't you, that we're in the midst of that revolution? Canada absorbed and implemented these ideas, English Canada with British common law, and Quebec with the Napoleonic Code. Both continue to assume women's subservience to men. These laws and the customs that grew from them continue to this day to have a pervasive effect on the legal status of women. For instance, the law never specifically required to use her husband's surname on marriage, but them being one person in law, that became a natural follow-up to it, and a way to show that a woman gave up her own individual identity and she took up the name and identity of her husband. The culture, I mentioned about Blackstone saying that man could give his wife moderate correction. The culture accepted that. Just one example. Growing up in the 1950s, I used to watch on television, does anyone remember it, the Jackie Gleason show? The Honeymooners. It was a comedy which featured a man who regularly threatened his wife with, "One of these days, Alice, pow, right in the kisser." And everybody laughed. It was part of the culture that men did that to their wives, and people laughed. No one to my knowledge, not that I would have known necessarily, ever complained that this encouraged assault against women. Of course, this was portrayed as happening within a home, and the law and the police chose not to interfere with matters within the home. In fact, in Canada, it was not a crime until 1983, now that's only 35 years ago, for a husband to rape his wife. Marriage was considered consent to conjugal relations whenever the husband wanted them. Now, of course, many men did not take advantage of their position, but those who wanted to could do so, usually with impunity. That's within a marriage, but these ideas didn't stay inside the front door of the home. Men took these ideas about women with them wherever they went, wherever they worked, into whatever role they played. Men took their preeminence and power over women with them into every walk of life. And when women joined the workforce in greater numbers starting about 50 years ago, they came up against men with ideas about male power that had been inbred into them, but so did the women. Even when women joined the workforce, the power imbalance continued, and the assumptions continued to underpin the relationships between men and women and society's views of women's role. Now, I'll talk about the world of work more in my second lecture. So, where were the women in all this? The men enforced the rules in daily life and the laws protected them, but the women went along. We didn't think we had a choice, and we probably didn't. Women were raised to believe that we needed to marry, both for security and for social standing. We absorbed our secondary role with our mother's milk. We believed that it was the man's right to choose, and we only wanted to be chosen. Now, I know I'm reflecting the 50s and earlier. For those young people here today, it's a history lesson, I hope. We permitted ourselves to think that that's the way the world worked, and it was the right way, and we accepted it. Now, we all know that women learned how to work and survive within this system with the deck stacked against us. Many learned how to manipulate men. The negative side of this was that this tied these women tighter to men, and they were less inclined to support other women. In fact, women competed with other women for the favor of men, for the prize male. Now, I remember that women in the 1950s went to university to get what was called an MRS degree, to get their missus, to find a good, educated mister. And that's what education was supposedly about. In the process, many women sided with men and the male point of view and supported a male sense of entitlement. A recent astonishing, for me anyway, example comes from the 2016 American election, when white female voters supported Donald Trump over an accomplished woman. It demonstrates what we face in our fight for equality. It's a possible explanation for why these women voted as they did, but it still makes no sense to me that any woman would vote for a misogynist. The late Ursula Franklin called the type of woman who supports the patriarchy a lady patriarch. They play the men's game. They survive by being the token females who got ahead without supporting their sisters. Some of them feel they advanced because of merit, and if other women don't advance, it's because they lack merit. Many of those women also feel that way. The victims blame themselves, instead of understanding that it's a systemic problem that's in society as a whole. So this is the foundation on which our present society is built and still exists for many people. Men's physical strength secured their place in the world, and women's ability to reproduce secured our place. The world has changed since the assumptions about women formed the culture and the law. Male physical brawn is not needed in the same way it once was. There are machines like technology, robots, and drones to make up for an absence of strength. And exercise for women with weights to build up strength has become part of our culture. In days of yore, it was considered unladylike. And women, since 1961, have been in a better position to control reproduction. That's when the birth control pill first became available in the United States. Since 1969, just 50 years ago in Canada, contraception became legal and abortion was for the first time partially decriminalized. A woman could obtain an abortion if a committee of 3 doctors verified that her life or health was in danger. Then in 1988, abortion was completely decriminalized in Canada, one of the world's few countries to do so, because of the efforts of a male ally, Dr. Henry Morgentaler, and the decision of the Supreme Court of Canada, encouraged by the efforts of the Canadian women's movement and supported by the 1982 Charter of Rights and Freedoms, our equality rights in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was achieved with the help of the Canadian women's movement. With the ability to choose when and if to have children, women had the opportunity to become independent in a way previously unknown in the world. So the current reality makes it possible to talk about evening the odds as men's physical strength becomes less relevant and women can control our reproduction. It makes it possible to talk about equalizing the power. When women have our own power, when we're not dependent but independent, we will not need to compete with other women for male favor or survival. We'll be able to deal with the violence which men use as a tool of control. One of the ways, of course, is that being economically independent, we have a better chance at getting out of the home in the case of violence. But to do so, the laws must favor us. And do remember that in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, where we have equality rights, there is also a second section to that section that says that affirmative action programs are well within the law when you're dealing with equality rights. So there can be special programs that favor women in order to put us in a position of equality. The other thing we need to do is women must be part of a sisterhood to secure power and then to sustain it and to work together. We must cleanse our own and other women's minds of the misogyny that's been inculcated into us and which still governs the behavior of some of us. And awareness is a start. Now, I don't mean to promote conflict or hatred between men and women, but the exact opposite, to create a different paradigm for society of a partnership of equals, in which the law protects everyone equally and fairly. So the subject for today is violence. And I think we all know what that is, but it's not only the obvious, the intentional use of physical force, which is intended to and does cause harm and includes intimidation by threats. It's also subtle and not so subtle coercion to force women to bend to the will of someone else. It's threats, it's ridicule, it's all kinds of behavior that abuses the woman. And it takes place in intimate partner violence, including date rape and domestic violence. There's sexual assault, both intimate partner and stranger. There's sexual harassment and stalking. But there is also financial abuse, coercive behavior, and defamatory conduct. The first study of abuse in Canada took place in 1980, and I was on the Ontario Status of Women Council at the time and was shocked by information shared by researcher Linda McLeod in a study she did for the Canadian Advisory Council on the Status of Women, which reported that 1 in 10 Canadian women, about 500,000 at the time, were estimated to be battered by their husbands every year. This was not considered a major social problem. There was little help for these women, whether from police, doctors, shelters, crisis centers, or the law. So we had a few women in Parliament, very few at the time, but Margaret Mitchell was a member of Parliament, and she got wind of these statistics, and she brought the issue to the floor of the House of Commons in Ottawa on May 12, 1982. She asked the Minister for Women's Issues what action the government planned to take to protect battered women. She pointed out that 1 in 10 Canadian husbands beat their wives regularly, but she could get no further because of the laughter and heckling from the male parliamentarians. They drowned her out. They laughed at her. They ridiculed her. She wrote a memoir about it, titling it No Laughing Matter, which indeed it was. It was a shock to Canadian women to realize that men in power did not take the problem seriously, and it was the beginning of the efforts of the women's movement to try to change these facts for Canadian women. The statistics continue to confirm the extent of violence against women and are horrific. Back in 1994, Statistics Canada reported that an estimated 29% of Canadian women who'd ever been married or lived with a man in a common law relationship had been physically or sexually assaulted by their partner. This was even higher than the 1980 numbers. In 2002, Statistics Canada reported that 1 in 5 solved homicides had been committed within a relationship and 4 out of 5 victims were women. Statistics Canada reported in 2014 that across Canada, a woman is murdered by her partner on average every 6 days. And men mostly got away with this behavior. Only 1% of sexual assaults, for example, resulted in a conviction. But as we all know, times are changing. The big news, of course, is the Me Too movement. In my over 40 years of feminist activism, I have to say I would never have imagined in my wildest dreams the possibility that women en masse would speak up against sexual harassment and assault, that the allegations would be dealt with swiftly and firmly, and that men could no longer count on avoiding retribution for their behavior that they and their enablers once shrugged off. Me Too, of course, is an abbreviation for the message that women won't take this abuse anymore but will challenge it. There was a conspiracy of silence by women which played into the hands of the men who wanted to keep it quiet and encouraged them, in fact, to act with impunity. No one should really be surprised by the events described by the Me Too movement. The big surprise is really that women came forward at all, even though it was an open secret, and even though gender-based violence was classified by the United Nations as a global pandemic, it remained hidden. So the movement went live with celebrities. We all know who they are. And it seems a day doesn't pass by without another allegation. Now a U.S. Supreme Court nominee is being challenged for abusive behavior when he was 17. It will be instructive to see whether this conduct, if proven true, will be excused as boys will be boys. Or as Trevor Noah said on his program last night, what do you mean boys will be boys? Not me, I never did anything like that, right? As many didn't. In any event, I believe Christine Blasey Ford's allegations against Brett Kavanaugh and admire her willingness to come forward in the public interest after what happened to Anita Hill when she challenged Clarence Thomas's nomination in 1991. But she's under attack with death threats, online abuse that's horrendous. She had to leave her home. She had to relocate her family. In what she's doing is standing up for women because it can't help her. She's standing up for women and challenging the appointment of a judge who has promised to bring down Roe versus Wade, the decision that opened up the legal right to abortion for American women. So we must be grateful to the women who complain because they're being examples of sisterhood in action. Now, it's the women with power who started the Me Too movement, but it really must improve the lot of all women if it's to last, and it must involve all of us. And it must also be seen to be fair to both sides, rather than a shift from believing the men to believing the women. Assumptions are not justice. We must look impartially at the evidence in each case and follow a legally appropriate route to do so. That's if the issue has legal implications, if there's a law against it. We live by the rule of law, not intuition, assumption, tradition, or anything else that speaks to generalities. But it's difficult to await a legal result when numerous women come forward with the very same painful secrets which show a pattern on the part of the perpetrator. Then the court of public opinion will find it very easy to jump to conclusions. With many of these men, you can't say they didn't know they were behaving badly. Why else the contrived way to maintain secrecy, then use non-disclosure agreements? But let's look at the laws that we have here in Canada that help us deal with these issues. And one is the law against sexual assault. And I'm starting with that, although that's the most serious of them for a reason you'll see as I go. Now, sexual assault used to be called rape and still includes conduct that was formerly defined as rape, which included penetration. Sexual assault is a criminal offense which means it's considered by society to be a very serious transgression. Criminal law is federal in scope and has the same rules across Canada. A crime must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and the penalties include imprisonment. It's defined on a continuum, the same as assault, without a sexual context. Basic sexual assault carries a jail sentence of up to 10 years. Sexual assault with a weapon, threatening or bodily harm, up to 14 years. Use of firearms is a factor that will increase the penalty. Sexual assault aggravated by life-endangering behavior can bring life imprisonment, at least in theory. It's a continuum offense. Now, sexual assault can come about in a intimate partner relationship, or it can result from date rape. We've seen a real example in the news of date rape by Bill Cosby's drugging of prospective sexual partners over a period of many years, finally resulting in a recent conviction and today's sentencing of 3 to 10 years and being found to be a sexually violent predator. So I guess the message to men like him is, when a man wants to shortcut the seduction process, apparently feeling entitled to a woman's body even without her consent, he'd better think twice. But on the other hand, think of how many years it took. Think of how many years it took, and one woman, then many, many women, all these other women, 60 women came forward, but it was too late for them to press their cases, and if they'd done so earlier, maybe he could have been stopped. Women have always had a difficult time charging and bringing to justice the men who have assaulted them, because they often were not believed by the male police officers and judges. Some form of blame the victim was the frequent response, as if a woman had only to say no, or tighten her legs together, or dress differently to forestall improper male conduct. It was considered the responsibility of the woman to control male misbehavior, when it's the men who must control themselves. Since the mid-70s, the Canadian women's movement has been successful in helping to hone the laws dealing with sexual assault, hopefully make the court experience better for women, at least attempt to do so. But unfortunately, it hasn't been successful. There's a situation now in the courts where women do not have an easy time as victims dealing with a sexual assault case. But then changing the law wasn't enough, because it was mostly male police who applied the law, and they stopped the victims in their tracks before charges were laid by finding the cases were unfounded. In other words, the police did not believe the women. This only changed as a result of a major investigative study by the Globe and Mail last year, their Unfounded series, which showed that police dismissed 20% of complaints before they even got to court. In fact, Statistics Canada didn't really think it was a serious problem. They stopped tracking the information about sexual assault cases in 2003. And it was only after the Globe series basically challenged them, that they, in 2018, July, 2 months ago, started to track those statistics again. So there's all kinds of ways in which women have to fight against what's happening, even the statistical analysis of it. Then the problem is that defense lawyers treat women very badly in court. Prosecuting lawyers do not train them as witnesses sufficiently, and judges do not protect them. That's all summarized in a very good book, if anyone's interested in that aspect, by Elaine Craig, Putting Trials on Trial, Sexual Assault and the Failure of the Legal Profession, where for those lawyers here, she says that the law society should have a responsibility to ensure that there is civil and cordial conduct in a court of law, even when you're dealing in cross-examination of a victim. We'll see whether the law societies find it of interest to pursue that. I think that the law society should be encouraged to do that. I think a victim needs her own government-paid legal counsel to represent her throughout the proceedings, starting with the first interview with the police. I think we need specialized courts with specially educated judges, and we need trained police with specific expertise in sexual assault law. Now, I've dealt with what happens when the victim complains to the police and goes to court, but there's also a question of how do you prevent murders from happening? And there is an interesting example can't go into too much detail on, but in the United States and Massachusetts, they do proactive imprisonment of suspected offenders. They have found a way to proactively try to prevent domestic violence from descending into murder. They create a domestic violence high-risk team coordinating with police, hospitals, and the courts, which prevent domestic violence homicide by predicting when it'll happen. I don't believe we have anything like this here. They developed a danger assessment tool of 20 risk factors to help pinpoint when abuse is likely to escalate to homicide, including substance abuse, gun ownership, a record of violence, forced sex, threats to kill, and choking. And they devised a weighted scale, and they were right most of the time. The other thing they did was the standard bail hearing did not get resolved on the basis of whether the defendant was a flight risk, but on the basis that of the dangerousness of releasing him, which is a different way of looking at it. So I think that's something that we should be thinking about. The other thing we should be thinking about, because the subheading of my theme is solutions to the unfair treatment of women, is gun control. I'm not an expert, I don't pretend to be, but I do know this. In the hands of men who are violent against women, guns are dangerous. And the only way to control violent men using guns is to control guns, because we can't control the men who use those guns. I also know that the experiences of women in Canada have been missing from active consideration in the debate on gun control. And in determining risk for domestic violence in the home, guns remain the single most important factor to determine whether a violent episode will result in a fatality. Canadian statistics show that access to firearms by an intimate partner increases the likelihood of murder by 500%. Now, the Trudeau government is considering changes to the gun control laws, but one of the big things I think that we should all be urging them to do, because they just announced they're going to have a public consultation, is to ban all handguns, period. Now, that's sexual assault. Then there's sexual harassment. Sexual discrimination, it was part of sexual discrimination under human rights codes until 1978. And it's only, I say only, there isn't only, a breach of the human rights codes, but it's not considered a crime against society. And under the human rights codes, it's mostly arising in the context of employment, or sometimes in accommodations, goods, and services. Those are in the human rights laws. But mostly we hear of sexual harassment in the context of employment. 94% of male executives were asked if they thought there was a problem of sexual harassment in their companies, and they said it wasn't a problem at all, 94% of them. However, 30% of women workers said they'd experienced sexual harassment. Another survey of women said 50% replied that they had suffered sexual harassment at some point in their careers. And the Globe writer commenting on this say, the results show a profound disconnect between executives' beliefs about the problem and employees' realities. Now that's an understatement. There's considerable confusion among the public, I think, on just what sexual harassment is and where it fits in the legal list of prohibitions, and just where it nudges up against sexual assault and where it's distinctively different. The downside is that being under human rights codes, sexual harassment must be challenged by the individual complainant. It's not dealt with as a systemic issue, resolved through systemic measures. Moreover, being under human rights protections means it does not apply where sexual harassment takes place outside employment, accommodation, or services. So it makes me wonder whether one solution to this is to create a separate sexual harassment a law dealing with sexual harassment as part of the law of the province. Now, the difference between the two is, a good example is the Giangameshi case, because he was found not guilty of the criminal offense of sexual assault in a trial, but was still fired by his employer, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, for creating a toxic workplace environment by sexually harassing behavior toward other employees. So he was found guilty on one score, but not on the other. I think that as shown by the Giangameshi case, he was involved in both. And I don't think it's either or. Sexual harassment can escalate to be assault, as prohibited by the criminal code. I think men in charge at work who think that demanding sexual favors from female employees is acceptable are acting outside the law. In the strict definition of assault that I was taught in law school, it's any unwanted contact that can amount to assault. A person commits assault when, without the consent of another person, he applies force intentionally to that person directly or indirectly, and he attempts and threatens to do so, and/or attempts and threatens to do so. So my thought was that the criminal law sexual assault definition should be expanded. There's already 3 forms of sexual assault under the criminal code. And if we add as basically the first offense is sexual harassment, make it a criminal code offense, make it national in scope, make it monitored by the police rather than by employers, we may be able to stop some of the harassing behavior before it escalates. Because I think it's been found that sexual harassment is where it starts, but it's not where it ends. So I think the time has come for sexual harassment to be criminalized. Now, other issues we have is defamation. I was saying before, the kinds of threats and ridicule and online harassment that takes place it certainly exists, and I think should also be made a criminal offense. Right now, there is an offense of defamatory libel, but it does not include online abuse. And I have a strong opinion about online abuse, which I think is becoming a big part of our society, and I think is affecting many people in an adverse way. So right now, there's no specific provision in the criminal code prohibiting cyberbullying or even bullying more generally. The law will only intervene under existing prohibitions like uttering threats, intimidation, extortion, false messages. There are things that can be pursued under the criminal code, but not online, and I think it has to be added. There's a criminal offense of stalking or criminal harassment, which includes following, watching, communicating, and otherwise engaging in threatening conduct. It was created in 1993 to deal with threats to women, to prohibit conduct that caused a woman to have reasonable fears for her own safety or the safety of someone known to her. I think that online stalking and criminal harassment should be added. By the way, Manitoba has done so in its new law, just enacted in 2016, which includes online harassment in the definition of stalking for their provincial legislation, but I'm talking about the National Criminal Code. Then I want to talk for a bit about misogyny. Misogyny, you may not know, I don't know how many of you know that it's now a hate crime. Did you know that? It's a hate crime. For the last year only, promoted by the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, And it now is regarded as a hate crime since 2017. Incitement of hatred was added as an aggravating factor also for sentencing purposes. So I've said that I want to deal with online abuse in many areas. In order to do that, I think what we have to do, and I can't say I know how, but I hope that the experts in online stuff know how. I think that we should disallow anonymity. I think people have to use their own names online. That the reason why trolls and other abusive comments can be made online with ease is because people aren't using their own name. They're hiding behind a pseudonym. They're hiding behind some made-up name. And if they have to use their own name, they can, first of all, then maybe they wouldn't quite say as much as they did, but also they could be pursued for defamation. And I really do think that we've got to, as a society, control what's going on online. The other thing we need to do is massively increase the funding for shelters, for the legal advice to be given to victims, to help them to move, to give them armed security forces, to enable them to stay in their homes if that's possible. There's so much abuse going on that needs to be dealt with, and so many of these women are left to their own devices or to shelters that are underfunded, and they're funded more by volunteers than they are by government. In 2008, there were 596 shelters in Canada, and while more than 101,000 women and children spent time in them, more were turned away because the shelters were full. In 2014, Statistics Canada found there was a modest increase to 627 shelters for abused women operating across Canada with 12,058 beds. During this time, shelters across Canada reported 60,000 admissions of women, and 78% were there for reasons of abuse. I mentioned Dr. Morgentaler earlier as a male ally. I think that women have a lot of male allies, that not every man, I'm speaking very badly of men as a generality, as a group, and of course we all know that that does not apply to every man. But the male allies we have to help us. They have to speak up, and they have to be active in our aid. There's an organization called the White Ribbon Campaign that formed in 1991 by Canadian men, and their banner is, "Our future has no violence against women and girls, and toxic masculinity hurts everyone." So I am going to just tell you briefly that on October 23rd, I'll be talking about empowering women at work on issues such as pay equity, employment equity, childcare, work-life balance, quotas, unions, and more about sexual harassment. And on November 20th, I'll be talking about challenging the centers of power and discussing women's political representation. And in that context, electoral reform and quotas, corporate representation on corporate boards, education, family life, and more. If you want to be on my email list to be reminded of the next two events, I left a pad of paper on the table. You can, at the end, put your name and email address. Overall, we're dealing, as I think, with a cultural hangover from times past. That equality of power means evening the playing field, rebalancing the odds, and ensuring everyone is treated fairly. The days of expecting change to happen because it's only fair isn't going to happen. We have to take active efforts in that department. And so just to summarize, the solutions to the unfair treatment of women in my subject today of violence as a tool of control, education of police, lawyers, and judges, involvement of provincial law societies, government-paid legal counsel to represent the victim from the first interview on, specialized courts with specially trained judges, domestic violence high-risk teams, early intervention, emergency aid, gun control, banning all guns, criminalize sexual harassment, criminalize online defamation, criminalize stalking, criminalize the online use of stalking and criminal harassment. The same with hate crimes. Anything online should be abolished, and we should disallow anonymity on the internet, as well as money for shelters. And while we need male allies, we need a whole lot of real sisterhood. I would love to have you ask questions and make any comments. And we're going to have a microphone set up there if you could come to it. The library has a policy of not allowing us to videotape your face, but listening to your question on the microphone would be helpful. So,
Linda, do you have any thoughts on why now? Like, what was the tipping point for the Me Too movement? Like, it seemed to be nothing and then a big rush. Have you given any thought or done any reading, analysis about why the time was so right? Part one of the question. And do you anticipate or fear any kind of reprisal or pushback with the pendulum swinging the opposite direction?
well, why it happened now, really, it's almost as if there was so much abuse, the accumulation, that it reached a tipping point. I can't think of any other reason, other than, the other part is, it started with powerful women and celebrities. They had the money, they had the position, they were finally able to do it because they had that level of independence. I think it was kind of those two things, but still, I mean, there have been powerful women in film and in movies for a very long time, and the Harvey Weinstein type behavior has been happening for a very long time. So your guess is as good as mine. It could just be that somebody got the nerve to speak out, and everybody thought, oh, now it's okay to talk. It's like you need a leader, and there was a leader. That's all I can say. Now, you're saying, your second question was whether there's going to be a pullback. Well, I think there's certainly going to be an effort to pull it back, and for men to try to reclaim some part of their reputations. But I think that if women keep coming forward as they've been doing ever since this started, I don't think they're going to be allowed to. Look what happened when Jian Ghomeshi wrote a piece in the New York Review of Books. And I mean, I saw the piece on my Facebook feed before I even read it in the newspaper. And by the time I read it in the newspaper, he was being slammed down and the editor was fired, right? Because he didn't give both sides of the story. He just let Jian Ghomeshi tell his side. It wasn't balanced reporting. But the future is something. It will. The Me Too movement will continue indefinitely if women keep at it. But look, they had 6 women on television last night saying that Christine Blasey Ford, who's speaking against what Brett Kavanaugh did, that, I mean, it's just, you know, they were kids, and why did she this and why didn't she that? And they were not favoring her. So there's women and there's women, right? I mean, we aren't all the same, are we?
I want you to enlighten me on a certain area. I believe that due process is being eroded, disappearing, and I want to know what you think of people's lives being ruined by allegations and not due process.
Well, I think that when the allegations are made in a court of law, the rules of evidence apply, and therefore due process applies. If it's a criminal offense, and Jian Ghomeshi, as the example I was giving earlier, in a court of law, he was able, through the use of the rules of evidence and a good lawyer, and he was able to be found not guilty. On the other hand, I think the due process complaints come about more in employment situations because it's the employer that has to take action. The CBC felt that Jian Ghomeshi was creating a toxic atmosphere. And he brought them a video showing that he had abused a woman, but he was doing it to show, he thought he was showing consent. All he did was show abuse, and I think that's what really got him fired. But employers don't have the same obligations of due process. Employers, nobody's got a job for life. They can be dismissed if there's just cause for dismissal, and there's rules about what's just cause and what isn't. And if it isn't just cause for dismissal, and an employer dismisses somebody, and it's wrongful dismissal, so they have to pay them in lieu of notice or give them notice, anywhere up to 2 years, roughly. So employers can do what they want in an employment situation. If somebody misbehaves, an employer can fire them, and as I say, justly or wrongfully, but they can fire them. So, and they can, hopefully, they're using appropriate methodology to determine whether or not the person should be fired. And if they don't, they'll get sued in a civil court. It's a different situation. It's one of the reasons why, if you're talking due process, I'd like to see sexual harassment as a criminal offense. Obviously, the penalties would be lower than it would be for sexual assault with life-threatening implications, but it would be on that continuum. Then you would have the possibility of due process for sexual harassment situations, even in employment. Okay?
Hi, Linda. Thank you very much. My question has to do with the theme of your talks, which is around the idea of power. I wonder if you can define for me define power for me, and do you think men and women view this idea differently? And maybe a follow-up to that would be, do you think that women aspire to power?
No, I don't. I think that's part of the problem. That's a very good question. Thank you very much for that question. I think that by nature, men have a greater focus on power. Where that comes from, I don't know. And women on fairness. Now there are people on both sides of that. You'll find women who are power hungry and men who are, look at fairness. But as a generality, I don't think women seek out power, but it's to our detriment. It's to our detriment, because having power doesn't mean we have to wield it abusively. I think actually that if there's to be fairness for men and women, it's probably better that women have all the power than men, because we're more likely to use it fairly. What do you think? Okay. Just a theory, yeah? You can ask? Okay.
Thank you, Linda. Just, it gets the wheels turning one more time, and I really appreciate that. In the spirit of action, you mentioned that there's going to be we're told there'd be a public consultation about the gun control. And it made me think of 30 plus years ago when I belonged to the Federation of Women Teachers Associations of Ontario, and we were fighting. And it was an organization that fought. We learned to fight and state our cases within a women's organization, and that was powerful. And I'm thinking at this time, back then, when we had affirmative action, when we had the backlash about women being promoted into positions of responsibility and all sorts of other women's issues that FW helped us with as the big membership, they also gave us scripts, if we asked for it, of the relevant information we needed to know. Because as teachers in classrooms, we had our heads above water, our noses sometimes, a lot of prep and a lot of day work without the extra research of what am I saying, why am I saying it, and what's the real issue here. So how do I respond to the backlash without just killing somebody? No, we wouldn't do that. So I'm thinking the same thing with this gun issue, to make it a violence against women, not just violence against our society, but how can we develop or get the information out so that other people have a ready script and try to encourage people to get out to these consultations. I, for one, didn't hear that they were talking of having them yet. And
This is just the last couple of days.
yeah. And I'm afraid this is going to be fast and furious, and maybe this is a time that we collectively can act again.
Well, I do know that the YWCA is part of a group with the Barbara Schleifer Clinic, and I think another organization that is working on this. Heather McGregor, the CEO of the YWCA, had an op-ed piece in the Star within the last week or two on the gun control issue. One of her big points being you need to listen to the women on this issue, that the YWCA is very involved in shelters and protecting women after abuse. And of course, the Schleifer Clinic does a lot of work in that area as well. And if you look on the website for the Schleifer Clinic, they have an open letter they did to the government. And if you want to get involved, I suggest you get in touch with Heather McGregor or Amanda.
Oh, she's not, no, Deepa Matu. Oh, that's, yes. So she's-
Okay, whoever's doing it at the Barbara Schleifer Clinic, Deepa Matu, okay. Okay, that's right, let's rabble-rouse. Okay, another question coming.
What do you think can sort of be helped to do to reduce the objectification of women in the media and reduce the effects of porn that is such widespread on the internet?
What a good question. You know, there was a women's groups in the 70s that was the Media Watch, I think it was called, that was making a big effort in this area. And unfortunately, the Freedom of Speech group and the anti-censorship group ended up controlling the agenda. And it's now considered, you know, just freedom of speech. But what's happening is that the ready availability of pornography is miseducating, uneducating, diseducating, whatever the word is, our young people. And I think that if, as a young person yourself, this is an area of concern for you, I'd love to see you get a group of friends together and start a group and monitor what's going on and raise these questions. It's a very difficult issue, though, because I don't think anybody's doing anything in a public way about it now, and haven't in many years. It didn't work, and we had to give up. But it's gotten worse because what's available has gotten worse. I rabble rouse, please. Another question? Okay, yes, we do.
Thank you. Thank you.
Give her this one.
Just give you this one. There you go. That's fine. Thank you for letting me hear your.
I can't hear you.
Thank you for
Thank
letting me listen your views about the violence on women in Canada. But I have some issues here that we are talking about the Canadian law.
Which law?
Canadian law.
Yes.
And we, in Canadian society, we have different communities. They have been harbored from all over the world, either Europe, Asia, Africa, and other part of the world. And every kind of woman, there have been some experience for violence from men or some sort of like anybody, just not men. But there is a silent abuse going in the society, and we overlook at it that when we are bringing the communities from other part of the world, and they are using women as a product or a toy, and if somebody violates it or some game is going on, the young women, they don't understand, and they just simply, some communities, like just for example, I'm not against that particular religion or anything, but they play just women as like a game, like Taharush, if you heard about it. And it usually play for women, those are not from particular community. And I noticed many times on the street and even in the pool, like when they see a woman with open clothes or something they are not used to, and it's kind of abuse is going on with those particular men especially. And women cannot walk, openly, or they swim, they just bring, and the women never notice that they are in abuse situation. Basically, they're using them, and then it's growing in the community. So there should be a law, like if we have Canadian law, then there should be a law that it gives them the same kind of punishment. Like women in Islam, like they have halala thing, and they silently, it's happening, I'm sure in Canada too. Like men marry them and then they divorce them, right? And they're going through a lot. And same thing, some men, they are using the Western woman just as a toy in the pool, I noticed many times. So it's a silent abuse.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. What she reflects is the different cultures have their own problems, their own unique problems, which may be the same as in Canada and may be different, but even some of the communities that come here from far away bring their own cultures and views with them, which may not be exactly what we in Canada are trying to promote. certainly there's many parts of the world where where abuse against women is a serious issue. And at the beginning of my talk, I spoke about what it used to be like in human history before the last 40 or 50 years. Well, in much of the world, it's still that way. I was speaking in terms of Canada. We in Canada have been able to develop a society which, while not by any means perfect, and we have a lot of work to do, is so much better than so many others have been able to have. I mean, just the fact that we've had abortion rights since 1988, right? I mean, that's quite an extraordinary thing in the world as a whole. But when cultures come here, they want to bring their cultures with them, and this can be a problem. I think as a family lawyer, I worked against the creation, the Sharia, people who believed in the Sharia law wanted to have their own law form, the family laws. They wanted family breakdowns to be determined according to Sharia law rather than Ontario family law. And led by the moderate Canadian Council of Muslim Women and many of the women in the women's movement, we managed to stop that. But it just shows you always have to stay vigilant. Okay. Oh, yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. And I'll confess I was late arriving, so you may have touched on this. But I just wanted you, if you could comment on the growing homegrown problem of human trafficking affecting our very young women as young as age 13. I understand that's the average age for girls getting involved, and most from foster care, but the growing number of girls getting involved are actually from affluent areas in our suburbs here in Toronto.
Yeah, thanks, Bev. No, I didn't deal with that, but it's an issue that relates very much to what I had to say about online abuse. Because generally speaking, these young girls are lured over the internet. They don't know who it is they're really talking to, and they get persuaded to do things that are not appropriate for them. And that's, again, this thing about I don't think we should have anonymity on the internet. People can't hide. I mean, it may not be an easy thing still to find them, even if we have that kind of a law, but it'll give the police some ability to assist. And it's part also of what this other young woman asked about what's happening on the internet, the pornography, and can't we control a lot of these things? And the luring of young girls for trafficking is a big issue. Thank you.
Thank you.